Assalamu alaikum everyone. Apologies, we're having technical issues with the slides, so we might not have any slides for tonight. No, I don't think it's working. So apologies for that. Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Before I forget, we are taking a break from Seerah during the school holidays. So that means we'll recommence on the 15th of July. So you're going to take the note, 15th of July is when we'll meet again for the Seerah. But in that time, please continue to read the Seerah so it's fresh in your mind. Go through any notes if you had any notes. And inshallah, we'll meet on the 15th of July. All right, let's start with the quiz. Now, I can't put it up here, but I'll give you the link. All right, so if you've got a smart device, go to www.kahoot.it. So that's www.kahoot.it. And the pin is 3110684. 3110684. That's www.kahoot.it, and the pin is 3110684. The man? Who's the man? There's someone who says them. All right, is everyone in? 3110684. 3110684. Okay. I'm guessing everyone's in, ready? Remember, you're getting points for the right answer, also the speed. It should come up on your smart device. So the questions should come up. I'll read it to you as well. It should come up on your smart device though. All right, are we ready? We've got quite a few people. Okay, Bismillah. All right, we're starting. 3116084. All right, question 1. Which of these was not a major empire at the time? The Roman Empire, the Abyssinian Empire, the Ghassanid Empire, or the Persian Empire? Which was not a major empire at the time? Which of these was not a major empire at the time? The Roman Empire, Abyssinian Empire, Ghassanid Empire, Persian? The answer is the Ghassanid Empire. The Roman Empire, Abyssinian, and the Persian were the three major empires at the time surrounding that region. 9 correct answers. Good job. Layla, good job again. You're leading already. All right, true or false? The Byzantine Empire is the same as the Eastern Roman Empire. The Byzantine Empire is the same as the Eastern Roman Empire. True or false? True. There's 4 wrong answers, 8 correct answers. It is the same, but it was always known as the Roman empires. They considered themselves the Roman empires, but even the Quran refers to them as Rum. They're referring to the Romans. It was much later that they were called the Byzantines to distinguish them from the Western Roman Empire. Moths on top. Along with the Himalaya and Ghassanid kingdoms, what was the third Arab kingdom in the region? Along with the Himalaya and Ghassanid kingdoms, what was the third Arab kingdom in the region? The Seleucids, the Seljuks, the Nabateans, or the Lakhmids? Remember I said there was 3 empires and there was 3 Arab kingdoms. The answer is the Lakhmids. The Nabateans were not a kingdom in that region. It's in Petra. So we're talking about the kingdoms and empires that were influencing the Arabs, the Arabs, the Quraysh at the time that were around that region. Karim, you have 3 correct answers in a row streak, so good job. What was the name of the chief idol the pagans worshipped? What was the name of the chief idol the pagans worshipped? Hubal, Lat, Uzza, or Manat? We're doing it online. There's an online quiz. It's all right. You got the answers? Yes, you're right, brother. It's Hubal. Got 6 right answers. Next question. Brother Imran said to call him if there's any issues. Do you want to give him a ring?
If we connect to the same Wi-Fi, we can cast it to the TV.
I'm connected to that Wi-Fi.
Oh, you are?
Yeah.
Okay. We can probably cast it.
I don't know how.
Just click there.
Cast.
Cast.
Sorry, we're just trying to overcome the technical difficulties if we can. No device found.
Not.
No. Maybe just call Brother Imran. He said to give him a ring if there's any. Imran? He said you know. All right, next question. Where was the biggest Jewish settlement in the Arabian Peninsula at the time? In Mecca, in Taif, in Hudaybiyah, or in Yathrib? Where was the biggest Jewish settlement in the Arabian Peninsula at the time? Mecca, Taif, Hudaybiyah, or Yathrib? Yathrib, good job. That most of you got it right. Karim. Where's Karim? Who's Karim? Good job. All right, next question. The council that established the Trinitarian doctrine was Council of Ibon, Council of Nicaea, Council of Corinth, Council of Rome. This was a council that was brought together by the Byzantine emperor to decide the doctrine of Christianity, and it was here the Trinitarian was decided. It was a Council of Nicaea. It's the Council of Nicaea. Karim, you still in the lead? True or false? Hanifism was an Arab movement which emerged to condemn idol worshipping. Hanifism was an Arab movement which emerged to condemn idol worshipping. True or false? False. False. They stayed away from idol worshipping. They didn't participate and they didn't like it, but they didn't condemn it. This was the distinction that happened when Islam came. Because up till then, the Quraysh didn't have a problem with the Hanifs. As long as you don't condemn us, you can do whatever you want. They had 360 idols. They had a portrait of Mary and Isa in the Kaaba. With Islam, what happened was they said, no, there is no God but Allah, and this is wrong. And that's where they got really upset about. All right, getting close to the end. What was the name of the faction that supported Hashim's leadership? The scented ones, the Confederates, Union, or the perfumed ones? The faction that supported Hashim's leadership. The scented ones, Confederates, Union, or perfumed ones? The scented ones. And they got the name because they dipped their hands in a jar of perfume and they made an oath to support Hashim and they wiped it on the Kaaba. The opposite faction was the Confederates. Qusay's son was Abdul Manaf. Who was Abdul Manaf's son? Qusay's son. Remember we did the lineage of the Prophet ﷺ from Qusay, and I said if you're going to memorize anything, please memorize this. Qusay's son was Abdul Manaf. Abdul Manaf's son was Shaiba, Abdul Muttalib, Hashim, or Abdullah. It is Hashim. Hashim. Husay's son was Abdul Manaf. Abdul Manaf's son was Hashim. Hashim was the one who was really smart and established the two trading routes to Syria and to Yemen and made Mecca a trading hub. And he was, some say he got his name because he was breaking the bread and dipping it in the soup as well. Last question. How many camels did Abdul Muttalib sacrifice to save his son? 200, 50, 300, or 100? How many camels did Abdul Muttalib sacrifice to save his son? 200, 50, 300, or 100? It is 100. Very good. Everyone got that right except for one person. All right, let's see who came on top. Mohd, number 3. The man, whoever that is, number 2. Oh, Kareem, good job. Sister Layla, you've been knocked off from your first place. The competition's on. Well done, everyone. Now, I don't know if you guys were here, Karim, I don't know if you were here, but my promise was that every week I will keep record of who comes on top and give points based on the top 3, and whoever gets the most points at the end of the Seerah, I will buy you a Seerah book. I haven't decided what book yet, but it's on me. Okay. Have we had any luck? It's there. Cast screen. Oh, is it casting? No. No luck. It can detect it, but it doesn't let me cast. Well, it's grayed out. Doesn't matter. It is what it is. All right. We tried. Okay. So before we start, I thought we'll start with a hadith about the Prophet ﷺ. And this one I particularly like because it brings to image a lot of attributes of the Prophet. But not only of the Prophet, but of some of the Sahaba. So this was told by Ibn Amr al-Hussein ibn Hurayth al-Khazi. Ali ibn Hussein ibn Waqib told us, my father told me, Abdullah ibn Buraida told me, that I heard Abu Buraida say. So that was the chain. Salman al-Farsi brought Allah's messenger, when he reached Medina, a table of ripe dates and placed it in front of the Prophet ﷺ. So he said, O Salman, what is this? He replied, charitable gift for you and for your companions. The Prophet said, take it away. For we will not eat a charitable gift. Salman therefore took it away. Then the next day, he brought the same thing in front of the Prophet ﷺ. And he said, what is this, Salman? He replied, a present for you, O Messenger of Allah, and for your companions. And the Prophet ﷺ said, spread it out. Then Salman looked at the seal on the back of the Prophet ﷺ's back, and he believed in him. So this is how Salman al-Farsi, and we know the story, we might touch on it during the Seerah, how he knew the Prophet ﷺ was a prophet, because as a Christian, he had heard that some of the marks of the Prophet was, one, that they will accept gifts but not charity, and there will be a seal of prophethood on his back, and he saw both of these. Now, Salman was a slave of a Jewish person, but the Prophet ﷺ purchased his freedom at such and such a price of silver and coin. But there was also a condition. The condition was that the Prophet ﷺ would plant date palms for this Jewish person, and Salman would work on them until they bore edible fruits. So the Prophet planted the date palms, apart from one date palm that Umar planted. The date palms then bore their annual crop, but one date palm did not bear fruit. So the Prophet ﷺ said, what is the matter with this date palm? And Omar said, O Messenger of Allah, I planted it. Prophet ﷺ therefore uprooted it, replanted it, and it bore its annual crop. It's really beautiful because it shows some of the traits of prophethood that people were looking out for, but more importantly, it shows the character of the Prophet. Think of it this way, the Prophet ﷺ not only bought Salman's freedom, he then agreed to plant date palms for this individual. And he could have said, why me? Why are you asking me to do it? But he didn't. He actually planted, I can't get the exact number, but he actually planted these plants. And while he was doing it, you see the characteristic of Omar. Omar's tough and he's always ready for a fight, but he was always very curious. He always wanted to do something and see what the Prophet was doing. So he decided to plant one of the plants. And that was the plant that didn't bear fruit. So it's a beautiful hadith, and I thought I'd share that with you, and we'll continue with where we left off. So, now, the year is 570 AD, or 570 CE. This is a very important year. Now, I know I've been told a lot of you, when you hear dates and years, it goes over your head. Understand, that's fair enough. But this year, please remember this one, 570 AD, or 570 CE, same thing. Two major events happened. One was more important than the other, but we'll touch on the lesser important one first. Now remember when I wish I had the slides, I would have showed you the map again. But remember when I showed you the map 2 weeks ago, maybe last week, I talked about the Himalaya Kingdom. The Himalaya Kingdom was right down where Yemen was, and they had the same color as the Abyssinian Empire. And I said these poor Himyarites are constantly getting colonized. They're either getting colonized by the Abyssinians or the Persians or the Romans. At this time, they were a colony of the Abyssinian Empire. And there was a governor who was put in charge of that region of Yemen. And the governor's name, the Abyssinian governor's name was, anyone? Abraha, correct. There was a guy called Abraha. Now he was pretty jealous of what was happening in Mecca. He was jealous of the fact that it was a religious hub, but he was also very jealous of the fact that it was a trading hub, that all the money from the north and south, the summer trade routes and the winter trade routes were going into Mecca. And he didn't like that. So what he did was he decided to build a massive cathedral in Sana'a, which is the capital of Yemen, in that region, and he decided to build a massive cathedral to diverge all the pilgrimages from going into Mecca to start coming down to Yemen. And he named it Yemeni al-Kaaba, not very creative, the Kaaba of Yemen. A lot of Arabs didn't like this. They saw this as sacrilegious because they knew that the Kaaba had a religious significance going centuries back. And they were thinking, how could this man just create something and say, well, this is as equivalent to the Kaaba? So one night, a Bedouin Arab sneaked into the cathedral and desecrated it. I won't get into the details, in a pretty horrendous manner. Now, Abraha was furious. He was furious, but he was also quite happy because this act gave him the reason. It gave him the Latin phrase, casus belli. You heard of the Latin phrase, casus belli? Cause, it stands for cause for battle. The word battle comes from belly. A reason for war, a reason to fight. He immediately gathered a large force. The book says 60,000. 60,000 seems very large to me, especially at that standard, but perhaps. A very large force and several elephants, and decided to march on Mecca. Now, I had the route for Mecca, but the route they took, but I can't put it up. They went up towards Taif, and when they reached Taif, the people of Taif freaked out. There's this massive army coming towards them, and what they did was they went and welcomed Abraha and said, you're going in the wrong direction. It's not us you want, it's Mecca. They're that way. And pointed them towards Mecca. Now the Meccans, the Quraysh, for many generations after held a grudge based on that, but we won't get to that. So Abraha then comes to the outskirts of Mecca. And in the outskirts of Mecca, there were some camels who were out on the pasture, they'd put out in the fields, and he captures them as loots of war. He captures the camels, and then he sends a message to the Quraysh leadership. He sends a message and he says, I want to talk to you, send your leader to me. Now remember, at this time, there wasn't a very clear leader because it was around this region that already, the conflict between the Sended ones and the Confederates, and there was an argument about who's going to be the leader. Abdul Muttalib was generally considered the leader, but his hold wasn't very strong. Anyways, they said, all right, Abdul Muttalib, you go and speak to Abraha. Now, as Abdul Muttalib comes towards Abraha, who's just camped outside of Mecca, he's very impressed with Abdul Muttalib. So as Abdul Muttalib enters, he gets up and he gives Abdul Muttalib a seat. And he tells Abdul Muttalib, we are not here to wage war with you. We do not want to fight the Quraysh. We do not want to have a war with it. We are here simply to destroy the Kaaba. So you guys get out of the way and we will destroy the Kaaba. Abdul Muttalib doesn't respond. But Abraha is so impressed with Abdul Muttalib, Abraha says, I will give you one favor. Any favor you ask of me, I will give it to you. He's thinking that Abdul Muttalib might say, give me money or save the Kaaba. But Abdul Muttalib gives a very strange response. He says, can I please have the camels back that you took? Those were my camels that were grazing on the field. Can you return them to me? Abraha is very surprised. He said, I said you can have any favor and this is what you ask for, your camels? And Abraha gives Abdul Muttalib gives a very interesting response. He said, I am the Lord of these camels, so it is my duty to protect them. The Kaaba has its own Lord, and that Lord will protect the Kaaba. It's a bit of a shock to Abraha, but he said, fine, you can have your camels. He gives the camels back to Abdul Muttalib. Abdul Muttalib takes the camels, goes back to the Quraysh, and they've now gone into the hills around Mecca, and they're waiting to see what happens. As they near the Kaaba, now this massive army with several elephants are nearing the Kaaba, their lead elephant is right in front. He sits down. And no matter what they try to do, he refuses to get up. They turn the elephant's head to the right. They turn the elephant's head to the right and he gets up. They turn the elephant's head to the left, he'll get up. He's willing to walk to the right and left, but he's refusing to walk towards the Kaaba. And they're prodding him, they're pulling him, they're pushing him. No matter what they do, the elephant will not budge. While they're struggling with the elephant, and I'm going to read from the book itself, an event happens. Everyone knows what this is? Everyone knows what's going to happen next? Suddenly, it was too late. The western sky grew black, and a strange sound was heard. Its volume increased as great waves of darkness swept upon them from the direction of the sea, and the air above their heads, as high as they could see, was full of birds. Survivors said that they flew with flight like that of swifts, and each bird had 3 pebbles the size of dried peas, one in its beak, one between the claws of each foot. They swooped to and fro over the ranks, pelting as they swooped, and the pebbles were so hard and launched with such velocity that they pierced even coats of mail. And another reading that I've read is that the pebbles actually hit where it hit the flesh started to fester and would get infected. I have a question for you. When you first heard of this, or maybe even when you hear of it this time, has anyone wondered, did this really happen? Let's be honest, did anyone wonder, did this really happen? Is it scientific? Can it have happened? I'll admit I did when I first read it. I did. I said, surely, birds with stones pelting, maybe it's an analogy for something else, for mosquitoes, something. But this book does a really interesting thing. It makes you stop and think about this. So, if, with your permission, let's discuss that a little bit, whether it really happened. In this world that we live in, we're based on an evidence-based society, correct? What we see, we feel, has to be based on evidence. So if you look at it from an evidential point of view, let's look at the history of this. After the 60,000 strong army was annihilated, the Abyssinian Empire never recovered because that was their major force. Almost immediately after, the Himalaya Kingdom was then invaded by Persia because the Abyssinians couldn't hold it anymore. and it then became a colony of the Persian Empire. So something would have happened to destroy the army. At the same time, the Abyssinian Empire got so weakened that they never became a superpower again. That was the historical effect of this particular incident. It had bigger repercussions than just the Kaaba being saved. It had a massive political repercussion in that region. And we know this historically. We know that at this time was the time that the Abyssinian Empire started to fall, and Yemen, Abyssinia lost its control over Yemen, and Persia took its control. The second thing is, let's look at it from an academic point of view, right? Academically, when you have sources, you identify which sources are strong sources, primary sources, secondary sources, which are very strong, which has good witnesses to back up those sources. This is, in Islam, the hadith sciences. And we have scholars who specialize in this, the muhaddiths. They specialize in finding the hadiths, the sources, and identifying how strong they are. And we all know what a strong hadith is called. What? What is it? What's a strong hadith called? The category of strong hadith. Anyone? Sahih. Sahih hadith, right? But did you know in the Sahih hadith category, now I'm not a hadith specialist, so I am very cautious in saying this. Please correct me if I say anything wrong. But in the Sahih hadith category, there are also subcategories. And one of the strongest, amongst the strongest hadiths, is the Muthawater Hadith. Anyone heard of this? The Muthawater Hadith? Does anyone know what that is? A Muthawater Hadith is one that's reported by a significant number of narrators at each level in the chain of narration. So you have a chain of narration. X told Y, Y told Z, so on and so forth. Now, if we have one chain, and if the chain is strong, it's still a Sahih Hadith. But if you have several chains saying the same thing, and each of those several chains have several people backing it up, and all those chains are strong, it is known as a Muthawatir Hadith, and the scholars say it is almost nearly 100% true. It is almost, there is no doubt on it. This hadith of the bird swooping down is unanimously, the scholars say, is a Muthawatir Hadith. The reason is there were so many eyewitnesses who saw it that there are so many chains of narration, all very strong chains of narration, that all say it happened. Okay? So we'll dealt with the historical evidence and we'll dealt with the academic evidence. There's one more evidence, and that's from the Quran in itself. You have to remember that this incident didn't happen very long ago, relatively in respect of the time we're talking about. So when the Surah Al-Fil was revealed, and this is Surah Al-Fil is about what happened with the bird swooping down on the pebbles, there were living eyewitnesses at the time. There were people who actually saw what this surah was talking about. And they could have said, no, this surah is not true, I was there, this never happened. But they actually said, no, I saw this incident that they're talking about. Does that make sense? Does that make sense? It is very hard then when you look at it from that perspective to say that it didn't happen. And no matter how strange it sounds to us in this day and age, if you are to take an evidentiary approach, then it happened. Is that everyone good with that? Yes. All right. So, like I said, there were many, many eyewitnesses who saw this happening. There was one person, though, who didn't see this happening. Anyone know who this person was? This person was trading. He was trading in Syria, and he never got to see this particular incident. Any guesses? It was Abdullah, the Prophet's father, sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Abdullah at this time, when all this was happening, was in Syria trading. And on his way back, he decided to stop in Yathrib and visit his grandmother's family. Remember I said that his grandfather Hashim met a lady in Yathrib and she agreed to marry as long as their child stays with her in Yathrib. Their child was Shaiba, who later became Abdul Muttalib. Therefore, Abdul Muttalib is Abdullah's father, and the lady who was in Medina was his grandma. So Abdullah, when he was traveling to Syria, decided to stop at his grandma's place and visit the relatives there. He stayed there for a bit, but as he was leaving, he got very, very ill. He got very, very ill. I'll come back to this illness thing when you get to Yathrib. We'll touch on that in a second. He got so ill that the caravan that he was coming with had to leave him there, and they came back to Mecca. They arrived in Mecca, and they informed Abdul Muttalib what had happened. Abdul Muttalib sends his son to get Abdullah. In the interim, Amina is in Mecca, quite heavily pregnant. And so they're all waiting for Abdullah to come back. His son goes to Medina, but when he reaches Medina, he finds out that Abdullah has already passed away. And so he comes back with the very sad news and tells Amina and Abdul Muttalib that Abdullah has passed away. It's a really sad situation because Amina is heavily pregnant. She's about to give birth, and the father's just passed away. She is now left in Mecca with the husband's family, with no support, all by herself. And you can imagine all the hopes and dreams that they had. You know, when the child is born, we're going to do this. When the child's born, this is going to happen. It's all gone. Completely unexpected. And I don't know if you, I have personally, I don't know if you have experienced a sudden death in your family. It's not only the death, it's the whole life, all your plans, everything turns upside down. And this is what happened to Amina. There was one consolation though, just one consolation for Amina. Through this sadness, there was something that kept her going. And it was a dream she had. One night she has a dream that a light comes out from her. And this light falls on the palaces of Busra in Syria. And she hears a voice, and it says, when your child, you carry on your womb the Lord of this people, and when he is born, say, I place him beneath the protection of the One, from the evil of every envier, and name him Muhammad. This was a dream that Amina has. Now at this time, no one knew the word name Muhammad. It was not common amongst the Arabs. Forget common, it wasn't used amongst the Arabs. And so Amina tells this to Abdul Muttalib, and Abdul Muttalib thinks this is very strange. Muhammad, what is it? Why? No one's been named this before. But he keeps it in the back of his mind. A few weeks later, on a particular day, something happens. All the way in Persia, in the capital of Persia, in the main temple, the Zoroastrian temple, they had a fire that was burning for 1,000 years. Remember I told you about Zoroastrianism? And we discussed this, and we said there's a fire that they kept burning 24 hours. This particular one in the main temple had been burning for nearly 1,000 years, non-stop, 24 hours. They kept it burning. For no reason whatsoever, the fire goes out. And no matter how much they try to light it, the fire will not come back. So we've got historical evidence of that happening on that day. On the same day, the lake called the Lake of Sabah, which was considered a holy lake that people around the region worshipped, dried up for no reason and would never come back again. And on that same day, Amina gave birth to a healthy baby boy, and he was named Muhammad. And Abdul Muttalib named him Muhammad, remembering the dream that Amina had told him. Do you have any questions so far? Are we good? Are we all following? No? Okay. Now, when the Prophet ﷺ was 1 year old, very small, was 1 year old, the time for fostering happened. You know what that means? Time for fostering? The Arabs had this tradition that the Bedouin tribes, Bedouin Arabs around the region of Mecca, every year or so would come to Mecca and offer to foster the newborn babies of the Quraysh. And there was a couple of reasons for this. One, it was understood that the environment in the desert where the Bedouins were living was much healthier for kids to grow up in. It was healthier, the air was cleaner, they could run around and play. And so the city Arabs, the Quraysh, wanted to allow their young children to experience that for the first couple of years of their lives. The second thing was, it was well accepted that the Bedouin Arabs had a much richer Arab language. They were much better in poetry. And at this time, the Quraysh, the Arab tribes, were a very vocal society. They passed stories through poetry, and poetry was the highest form of communication for them. So sending their children to live with the Bedouins was like sending your child to Oxford, to try and get the best quality education in poetry. The Bedouin tribes, on the other hand, had an advantage in this as well. They were not as rich as the Quraysh. So they would come to Mecca and say, I will foster your child for a while, I will look after them. In return, you will pay us to look after the child. One benefit. The second benefit is that they make these alliances. It's like one family makes an alliance with another family. The Bedouin tribes make an alliance with the Quraysh tribe, and the families kind of merge. It's like a marriage. So when you're a foster parent, you are now you're part of the big family of the Quraysh. So the time when Prophet ﷺ was 1 year old, the time came for these Bedouin tribes to come to Mecca. Amongst these tribes was a tribe known as the Hawazin. And the Hawazin was controlled by the Taif, the city of Taif. And in the Hawazin tribe, there was a clan called Sa'd ibn Bakr. And amongst the clan of Sa'd ibn Bakr, there were two very poor people. The lady by the name of Halima bint Abi Duaib and her husband, Harith ibn Abdul al-Uzza. They were very, very poor. They were probably the poorest in that clan. They decided to go with all their neighbors to Mecca to try and foster a child. The problem is that the donkey they were traveling on was very old and very weak, and so they started falling behind everyone else. All their neighbors were getting in front of them. By the time they reached Mecca, all their neighbors had gone and made the negotiations with the Quraysh families and parents and had already adopted all the kids that were available. The other problem was that they were so poor that none of the parents really wanted to give their child over them. They were like, how do we know you're going to feed them? How do we know you can look after them? So they were in a real difficult situation. But someone else was also in an equally desperate situation. Anyone know who that was? Amina. Amina was in an equally desperate situation because she was a widow. Her child was an orphan. The father had passed away. Now, you're probably thinking, well, Abdul, Muttalib, all the uncles, they're all rich. Yes, they are rich, but in the Arab tradition, the clan has a duty to look after a child when the father's not there, but the duty only goes so far as keeping them alive. They do not inherit anything. They have no wealth. They're not given any wealth. The wealth comes from your father. If your father is gone, you have no wealth. And this was the state the Prophet ﷺ was in. He had no wealth to inherit. Amina had no wealth to give him. So he had no riches. He was being looked after and kept alive, but there was nothing to his name. So none of the other Bedouin tribes wanted to take him, because why? What benefit is there? You're not going to pay us. So when Amina and Harith tried very, very hard to find someone and they couldn't, Amina says this. Let me see. Sorry, not Amina, I'm saying Amina. Halima says this. I don't have the page, but Halima says pretty much, we cannot go back home without a child. It is embarrassing for us. All our neighbors have come, they've adopted children. We cannot go back. We've come all this way. Let us go and adopt Muhammad. We know there's no money in it, but let's just do it. Maybe it'll be a charitable thing that we do, that we'll consider it as charity, and we might get some blessings from it. So Halima and Harith go to Amina and convince her to let them foster the little Muhammad, who is 1 year old. As soon as they take the baby and step on the donkey, the miracle starts straight away. Because this weak old donkey, who was falling behind all the neighbors, suddenly it's like he's got, he's drunk a Powerade bottle or something. He's out. He's leading the way, and all the other neighbors are starting to fall behind. And this donkey is galloping all the way. Where I had the map, but where Halima and Harith actually lived is about an equal distance, maybe a little closer to Mecca, the equal distance from Mecca to Medina. So it's about a 3 days journey approximately. This donkey did the 3 days journey and outraced everyone else. They get home, and Halima says that the children were crying because they were hungry. Because now remember, Halima is a witness because she has her own kids. This is what they were doing. They were fostering so that she becomes a wetness. They were saying, my child was crying and Muhammad was crying because they're very hungry. And they realized that their sheep didn't have milk at the time. So they're wondering what to do. And suddenly, the sheep that was there, suddenly their udders filled up with milk. And she said, I fed the Prophet and I fed my son, and they were both content and fell asleep. Throughout this time, things like this were happening. All the neighbors of Halima and Harith were asking them, what's your secret for the sheep to be so healthy and your camels to be healthy? Like, where do you pasture? Do you have like a secret meadow that you take them to? And they would even secretly go and try to follow to see where they're eating, because Halima and Harith's sheep were the most healthy. They were giving the most milk, and they prospered. And Halim and Harith knew immediately where this blessing was coming from. It was coming from the little Muhammad. Now, Prophet Muhammad ﷺ lived with Halim and Harith from the age of 1 till about 3 years old. Okay? They loved the Prophet ﷺ. They adored him, and they loved him, and they kept bonds with him. This is a kind of an indication. There's not a lot of hadith on the Prophet ﷺ in a very young age. But there are indications of his characteristic, because everyone who looked after him fell in love with him. So I assume we can take from this that he was a very loving child. And there are other things we'll touch on as we go about how he gave love back. Anyway, one day when the Prophet ﷺ was about 3 years old, he was out playing. Before that, I have to mention, they would often actually visit Amina. So it's not like they just stayed in there. They would come often to visit Amina. And the other funny thing is, Amina would say, all right, your time's good, now you can give him back. And they'd say, no. He needs a little bit more fresh air. He needs a little bit more time to play in the field. And they'd continue to convince to let Prophet Muhammad stay with them, because they were seeing all these blessings. So shortly after visiting Amina, they came back, and the Prophet ﷺ was in the fields playing with his foster brother. And his foster brother comes running to Halim and Harith. And he's saying, come quickly, something has happened to my Qurayshi brother. There's 2 men, and something has happened to my Qurayshi brother. Now this child is pretty small as well. And that's all he says. So Halim and Harith are frantic. They go running into the field, and they see the Prophet ﷺ lying down, 3 years old, lying down, and they pick him up. And later, when the Prophet ﷺ was old enough, thank you. Yeah, so later he narrates that while I was in the field, 2 men in white cloths came to me with a golden basin full of snow. They took me and split open my body. Then they took my heart and split it open and took out from it a black cloth, which they flung away. Then they washed my heart and my body with the snow until they made them pure. I don't know about you, but for a 3-year-old, that's pretty traumatic to see that 2 strange men appear, lay you on the ground, open your chest, take your heart out in front of you, split the heart open, take a cloth, wash the heart, put it back into his heart, and seal it up. And he remembered this, and he says later this is what happened. And also his foster brother saw this happening as well. Now, Halim and Harith, all this time, who was trying to convince Amina to leave the boy with him, suddenly changes their mind, and like, this is way too much, more than we asked for. Like, we don't know what's going on, but we're going to return him to his mom. So shortly after, they go back to Mecca and tell Amina, look, I think it's time for you to have him back. And Amina says, what happened? And initially, they don't tell her. Initially, they're like, no, he's grown up now. He's had plenty of fresh air. He can stay. But as Amina keeps insisting, they say, something strange happened, and explains to Amina, and Amina is not worried. Amina says, I always knew that there was something special to this child. And Amina says, he can stay with me. And he leaves, the Prophet ﷺ stays with his mother. So this is the age of 3. From the age of 3 till the age of 6, the Prophet ﷺ lived very happily with Amina. He was very close to his mother, and he was a very loving child. Everyone agrees that he was very loving, and Amina loved him dearly in return. At the age of 6, Amina and the Prophet ﷺ get on a caravan along with their slave Barakah, who was a very young girl. She was dark-skinned. People say she was probably from Abyssinia, dark-skinned, teenage girl, early teens. And there's a reason why I'm talking about her. I'll get to it in a second. They get on a caravan and they decide to visit their distant relatives in Medina. Now, Sammy, I think you asked me, was Amina from Medina? And I thought for a long time that Amina was from Medina as well. However, the book seems to imply that it's not necessarily her relatives he was visiting, it was Abdullah's relatives. The Khazraj tribe, who was Abdullah's grandmother, who he was visiting when he passed away. So they go to Medina, and the Prophet ﷺ has a very good time, and this is recorded in the books. He learns to swim in Medina, and I've heard, couldn't find a picture, I've heard that till fairly recently you could even see the tank where he learned to swim as a child. He learns to fly a kite, and you can imagine that he's learning these things, and he's showing his mother all the new tricks he's learned, and they stay there for a while quite happily. Then they decide that it's time to return on their journey back to Mecca. And unfortunately, history repeats itself. On their journey back from Mecca, Amina starts to get ill. At first, she's not that sick, but it gets worse and worse and worse. And they've reached a place called Al-Abwa. Al-Abwa is, I had the map, which I could have shown you, but it's halfway between Mecca and Medina. A little bit closer to Medina, but almost halfway between. At that point, Amina is so ill that they leave Amina, Barakah, and the Prophet ﷺ there, and the caravan says, we can't wait, you're delaying us, we've got to leave you here, but we'll go to Mecca and let them know, and they'll send someone for you. It is very remote. I had a photo of the place. If you see it, it is very remote. It is literally rock, sand, and that's it. There's nothing there. There is a sick and dying woman, a teenage slave girl, and a 6-year-old boy in the middle of the desert. And you can imagine, if you have 6-year-old children, my son's 5, so he's 1 year younger. They are intelligent at that time. They understand what's happening. The Prophet ﷺ is witnessing that they're in the middle of nowhere and his mother's dying. It is very difficult. If you ever thought that, yes, the Prophet ﷺ's life was hard, but he still had Allah, and the Prophet ﷺ's life was very hard. And I tell people that when you read his story, almost every, I won't say every, but almost every hardship you can think of, he experienced. Almost every hardship. And this was one of the first that he's experiencing. It was bad enough that his father died before he was born. He never saw his father. It was bad enough that his whole life he had to grow up knowing he has nothing to inherit when all his cousins and his friends had wealth. And the last thing he has was his mother, and 6 years old, middle of the desert with no support, and the mother passes away. And they bury her. I assume Barakah buries her because there was no one else with them, buries her in the middle of the desert. If you Google, I had the picture, if you Google, you can actually see her gravesite, which is there. It's kind of like on a hilltop overlooking pretty much nothing, just rock and sand. And Barakah, this young teenage girl, and the Prophet ﷺ stay there near the grave for days in the dark until someone from Mecca comes to pick them up. It is a very difficult situation he is experiencing, and a very, very sad situation. The trauma of this alone for someone else could have, who knows what could have happened, but he still retained his loving, caring personality, and you'll see that as we go on. The reason why I harped on about Barakah was, remember I said in the first week that when there is no place for racism in Islam at all, it cannot happen, because there was a racist comment, and I'll repeat it again, there was a racist comment once made by one of the companions of the Prophet to Bilal. There was a fight, and they said, you're nothing but a former black slave. Bilal got upset and went and told the Prophet ﷺ. The Prophet ﷺ was so angry, his nerve popped up, and he called the Sahaba who made the insult, and he said, do you know that I am the son of a white woman and the son of a black woman? He didn't say this is wrong, he didn't say this is haram, he didn't say, I'll give you a lecture. He said, I'm the son of a black woman and the son of a white woman. You being racist personally attacks me. It's a personal offense to me. Because after Amina passed away, the woman who stepped in was this young teenage girl, Barakah, who was a mother to him. And Barakah lived, he was one of the Sahabis who lived the longest. She outlived the Prophet ﷺ, and she lived for quite a long time. And the Prophet loved her immensely as a mother. So it's something to remember that racism is not only haram, you are personally hurting the Prophet ﷺ whenever that happens in Islam. When the Prophet ﷺ passed away, Abdul Muttalib, the grandfather, takes guardianship of the Prophet ﷺ. He comes and takes the Prophet. Now, Abdul Muttalib is quite old at this time as well. He's about 79 at the time. He takes charge of the Prophet and brings him to Mecca. And Abdul Muttalib loved this child. Like, he spoiled the Prophet ﷺ for a few reasons. One, he was the son of his favorite son, Abdullah, and Abdullah had passed away. One, because he felt pity for the child and sympathy because he had no one else. But the other thing is, Abdul Muttalib could relate to this child because remember, Abdul Muttalib, his first name was Shaybah. He came from Medina just the way the Prophet ﷺ did when his uncle came to pick him up and bring him to Mecca when his father, Hisham, had passed away. So history is repeating itself again. And so I wouldn't be surprised if Abdul Muttalib was thinking about this as he was bringing his grandson back, how he was brought back to Mecca. Abdul Muttalib and the Prophet ﷺ were inseparable. They always were together. Abdul Muttalib would have this habit of putting a bed near the Kaaba and having a nap. And when he had a nap, out of respect, no one would go near him. None of the grandsons, none of the sons, no one, except for the Prophet. Muhammad would go and sit on his lap, and he would hug him and kiss him, and everyone would say, look, there is Muhammad again with his grandfather, and he was the only one allowed on that seat with him. And they would cuddle together near the Kaaba. When the Prophet ﷺ was 8 years old, and Abdul Muttalib was 81 years old, he gets very sick, and he knows the time is coming for him to pass away. At the age of 8, the Prophet ﷺ has seen the death, or has experienced the death of his father before he was born, seen the death of his mother, and he's now seeing the death of his grandfather. He's been moved from one household to another household to another household. Nowadays it would be an incredibly traumatic experience for any child. He then goes, Abdul Muttalib calls Abu Talib, his son, and says, I'm passing away, and this child has no one. I'm giving you to him to take care of. Abu Talib's wife is Fatima. Remember I said there's a couple of key Fatimas that we're going to come across, so this is the second Fatima. Abu Talib and Fatima loved the Prophet ﷺ straight away. So this is again an indication of what a loving child he is, because everyone who sees him, everyone who looks after him falls in love with him. And the Prophet ﷺ would say that Abu Talib and Fatima looked after me the best they could. They treated me better than their own children. Now Abu Talib was quite poor. Abdul Muttalib had a bit of wealth, but Abdul Muttalib's wealth was getting distributed amongst many sons. Abu Talib didn't have a lot of wealth. So there were many days where they would go without food, but what Fatima would do is give the first share to the Prophet ﷺ and then to her own sons and her children. And do we know who their children were? Abu Talib and Fatima's children. Anyone can tell me? Ali's one. Anyone else? Jafar. The Jafar who went to Abyssinia, we'll cover that soon, inshallah. Hani, we'll cover her when we talk about her when we talk about the Isra and Miraj. These were the great companions of the Prophet ﷺ, amazing companions, and the Prophet ﷺ grew up with them. And they lived in the house of Abu Talib and Fatima, and they looked after the Prophet ﷺ, and they loved the Prophet ﷺ. And we will leave it there, and we will continue with the early teenage years and the adolescent years, inshallah, when we meet next, which is on the 15th of July. So we're taking a break. 15th of July, we're going to meet next. All right, thank you, everyone, and we'll probably have ISHA soon, so if you don't have wudu, make sure you get wudu. Assalamu alaikum. Alright, good, we're finishing off now anyways.
Next time I'll check with my computer.
Okay, let's...
Because we set it up so that you can...
It doesn't connect?
Connection is all, everything is alright, but what happened? I tried with the normal...
Saying to update and restart.